Hi, and welcome to this week's episode of Money with Alpha. This week, I wanted to talk about the impact of money stories and what money stories are, and then how they actually then impact our lives and our ability or our perceived ability to manage money. So, see, this is something I've had to work on a lot myself, and it's something I work on with my clients a lot because it's the foundation of what we all think is possible. And it's a little bit like even just to the point of being able to know that we can ask questions about certain things, or that as customers, we are the ones who have more of the buying power, but we're trained into thinking that we don't. And even just, there's a door. I see this a lot in toilets, which I know is a strange one, but everybody's waiting in line and there's this one door that's closed and everybody assumes that someone's in there. And then it takes one person to go and like push it. Oh, it's open. Or a door. We don't even try the doors. We just assume they're locked. If we're going through in an office environment or somewhere else even. And then we don't know until we try it. But our brains are wired to stay within the boundaries of what we think is either possible or not possible. And our stories define a lot of that for us. So if you think about what a story actually is, it's a narrative, it's a tale. It's there's a protagonist, there's a lead character, there's supporting characters, there's conflict, hopefully a resolution. But if we're in the story, and it's our life, so the story of our life, and we have protagonists, we have conflict, doesn't always get resolved. We have hurdles, we self-sabotage. There's so many things that happen in the story of life. And not everything gets resolved. We don't get answers for everything. Nothing is particularly clear, even what the end of the story is meant to be, because it is our life as well. So we don't necessarily see the end game as the ending. It's part of the story that we're in right now. And we're also different phases of life too. So there's some things where you do experience mourning, like MOUR, and and it's not necessarily the loss of a person, although that's tragic and that unfortunately does impact people during their lives to varying degrees. But it's also ends of friendships, ends of phases of life. And as a parent in particular, you see this a lot because there's so many phases in your child's life when you notice them growing up where they need you less and less. And then, some things change. And then before you know, they're leaving home. I have a family member at the moment who's got three children, and they're all still in their sort of mid to late teens, and two are, not necessarily out the door, but heading that direction. And it's happened a lot sooner than she probably thought about. And so there's an incredible sense of loss already, even now before it's really actually happened, but the anticipation of it. And so we experience that also with money too. And we think of things like the concept of imposter syndrome too, like oh, who am I to think I can do that? Or I don't know enough yet to be able to do something, or I'm not good enough at math or good enough at this. I don't know how to invest. I don't know how to do so many things. And that holds us back from even attempting to find out the solution to that part of the story or the resolution. We have that conflict, which is our lack of knowledge for the most part. And when it comes to money, we aren't taught it really anywhere unless we get a decent education from our parents, or you happen to have a really awesome teacher in school or a school that teaches financial literacy. Most of us will look on situations in our life as, the negative side. And as a brain, we're wired to survive. So we seek out negativity as a bias because those are the things that can hurt or kill us. So our brains are constantly on the lookout for anything negative to make sure that we can combat that and come up with a alternative scenario and what to do in case that thing happens. And that's also then fear too. Trust me, there will be, I'll bring this all together a little bit more clearly, but then there's the fear factor too. So many different acronyms I've heard for that. But the first one I ever heard, which I really love, was through Dr. John DeMartini. I'm in trouble saying that today. Future events appearing real. And so we have all of these stories. We have fear. We have our conditioning. We have the negativity bias. And there's all of this stuff that kind of blends in together to hold us back from actually progressing on a path that we want to. And this is where, when I first heard about the whole growth fixed mindset kind of concept from Carol Dweck, and you're like, oh, wow, yes. And it also helps to explain a lot of what goes on in our personal lives too. When you have a partner, perhaps, who is more fixed mindset than your growth mindset, it can create conflict, and especially how to communicate. But when it comes to money, I see there's a lot of fixed mindset. So while we might have a lot of, we're growing into a growth mindset in other areas of our lives, when it comes to money, there's just like this barrier, and we hit against this fixed barrier because it's something that we don't know how to progress beyond. We don't want to lose money. We don't want to risk too much. We don't want to seem silly. We don't want others to see the shame that we feel. There's a vulnerability aspect to it as well, about talking to it with somebody else and then them criticizing us perhaps, or ridiculing us, even more so, like there's all these fears and anxieties that go with it. And because as a society we haven't really normalized the conversation around money, we kind of talk about things like, oh yeah, we know what's happening in the economy and the interest rates and Bitcoin and crypto, all these sorts of things, and it's just surface level, almost items that we see in the news that we can talk about. So it's a detachment because it's just a news item, but how it impacts our lives. And what do we do? Do we pay off our mortgage, or do we invest, or do we do both? Or do we add more into super? As a business owner in particular, that's hard because you're like, well, generally prioritizing growing the business over things like super. So quite often when I see clients who have been business owners for a number of years and their super balances are quite low, and to be honest, women's super balances, even if they're employed, are often quite low anyway, especially for sort of like my generation in our 40s, because while super was around our whole lives, wages were quite low. We didn't necessarily salary sacrifice extra into it. I know myself was very cautious, and I didn't really trust the whole concept of superannuation in the beginning. I was like, is this really my money, or is it just going to somehow just disappear from me in retirement? There was all these sorts of paranoias around it as well. So a lot of this will hold us back. And so these stories, if we start to become aware of them, and that's the first step, is becoming aware of what's story and what's real. And that's a bit of a tricky one sometimes, because perceived reality is reality. So what we perceive to be truth and real is the same. It's akin to that. I've used this analogy before as well, where you see somebody who is very slender, and they have intense body confidence issues, and they just see someone who's fat, who needs to exercise more, who needs to eat less. And that's, there's eating disorders and the thing there's things that go around that are, there's more to it than just that. But it's that visibility. Like, we see somebody who looks stunning and they think they're ugly. Doesn't matter what we see, it matters what they see in themselves. And the same thing goes for money. What we see in ourselves when we look in the mirror in relation to money, we look around us and we chastise ourselves constantly for, oh, I can't afford. I was talking to my hairdresser today, because I got my hair done today, and she was like, oh, the cost of grapes are really high. And you're like, we might chastise ourselves for buying grapes for our kids, or, spending on this, or not getting a good enough deal on our home loan rate. Or do we try and, price match here? Or do I, call my insurance company to ask for a better deal? Am I allowed to do that? Is that okay? Things like that, where who do we have those conversations with to start with? So they swirl around in our heads. And these stories just get perpetuated. And because of the negativity bias and the conditioning that we have, and the fear that goes with that as well, and the imposter syndrome that all lays on top of it, it swirls around in our heads to the point where we just feel like an idiot. And we're like, there is no way I'm ever talking to anyone about money, because I'm just not good at it. And then if you start to become a little bit more aware of those stories, you're like, well, hang on a minute. Maybe there's others like me out there. And if you start to have like little conversations here and there, you start to realize there's a lot of people who are confused about money. There's a lot of information out there. There's a lot of cookie cutter things, and none of us are the same. I mean, all of our fingerprints are different. All of our DNA has differences. There's similarities obviously too, but as human beings, we are unique. And that's not to say that there's a way to manage money individually for every single person. There are some fundamental principles, but how you then choose to adapt some of those principles to you and your life and what you want, that you can customize. But it's understanding those fundamentals first is what often then holds us back. And then, we're often told by, the big corporations that this stuff's really complex. Well, yeah, some things are. If you want to be a day trader and you're doing foreign exchange puts and calls, yeah, maybe a little bit complex in the beginning until you learn it. And if you have a natural aptitude or if you want to learn it, I went down the path of trying to learn this, by the way, and I was just like, yeah, no, I'm not interested enough in that. I like investing, but I don't want to do that kind of trading. I had a cousin who was up at all hours of the night for whichever markets happened to be opening or closing. And I just looked at that and went, oh my God, that's insane. And yes, he made quite a bit of money, but there was a lot to it as well. And it wasn't the level of effort that I was prepared to put in. So you have to be aware also of your own personality and what you're interested in and what you're prepared to do to learn and to risk as well. But you don't have to take huge, massive risks in order to get ahead financially. Quite often it's slow and steady. I remember reading an article about this man. He was a janitor in a school for his entire career. And when he died, he left a legacy of $2 million. He had saved steadily. He'd bought his home and paid his home off little by little. And I think he invested in shares because I don't think he even had the money to get another loan to buy another house, even with the equity in the house that he had. So I think he was just investing in shares little by little over like a span of 50 years. And all of that, just that consistency and that discipline of regularly investing and paying off his debt in parallel. Just, he didn't buy into any of the stories and the complexity. I don't even know what his origin story was and how he even got to that point, or even thinking about doing that. But he didn't let not knowing how to invest or not knowing whether the property market was going up or down or whether he had the best interest rate deal to stop him. He just took one step after the other. I made a decision one after the other, and then and paid off debt and invested one day after the next. And before you know it, after like 50 years, he had amassed quite an estate, which a lot of people were surprised about, which is why he ends up in stories now, because they're like, wow, this is the power of compounding over time. And rather than just consuming constantly, also looking at the consumption instead of putting the money there, putting it into perhaps investments. And this is where one of the things I find really important as part of these stories is to understand what lifestyle you want. Do you want to retire? And again, I was having a conversation with a client yesterday, and she doesn't want to retire for about 10 years, but her partner wants her to retire in 5. And she's like, I don't even know if that's financially possible. So that's one of the things we're looking at. And going, okay, well, when do you want to retire? Like my husband is almost 11 years older than me. So clearly our retirement timeframes and horizons are going to be quite different. I also love what I do. So that comes into it too. Am I ever going to really retire? I don't know. That will depend. Maybe it'll just evolve and change and look a little different, or maybe where I do it is different. My work, that is. So it's having this level of awareness and then the curiosity, and then also going, okay, well, do I really need a new TV, or do I want to put that money aside for something else? Do I want to get to a certain investment goal by a certain time? And what really brought this home for me was when I would do it for my daughter. And this was another interesting thing. I don't think I've ever been so healthy as when I was pregnant, because I knew there was another being inside me that I was responsible for. So I was eating super healthy. And even when I was breastfeeding after she was born, I was so conscious of what I was putting in my body and the amount of movement that I was having, that I thought, geez, why do I not do this for me? I will do this for another person, in this case, my child, but I don't necessarily do it for me. So when I started to look at investments for her, I started an investment fund for her when she was about 3 months old. And we've been as a family pooling funds and progressively adding to that investment over the years. And I have an end goal. At the moment, I'm on track to exceed it, but that was where I started. I was like, I want it to reach this amount by this time. If I work backwards and go, okay, let's assume a certain amount of return, which was pretty conservative. How much would we have to add in now on a regular basis, like monthly? We put it together quarterly in order to reach that goal by then. So it actually made it a lot easier. I thought, yeah, it's great to have those kind, because then my every dollar then has a purpose. I have to make sure that those dollars go into that account every quarter. And then I've got other things that I manage and do as well. But I was like, yeah, that then holds me back from going, do we really need, like for instance, with our car, my daughter fell in love with a Toyota Kluger, but it was I think it was even secondhand, it was like $60,000. And the car we ended up getting was like $26,000. And I was like, yeah, no, this is fine. Like, we're a family of three. We don't have a caravan we have to tow. We don't ride on the beach. We don't go off road. We just need a sedan that's nice and simple and fuel efficient and does what we need it to do. And I was excited because I had power windows. My previous car didn't. So it's things like that where I was like, that extra, like, was it $34,000 could go somewhere else. So it was a lot more of a decision about that then. So that as soon as you become aware, you start to realize what's important, what are my values, what do I actually really need? And I mean, that's not to say we're still not frivolous, and there's some things, but I have a fund for frivolous things. So as long as I stay within the the budget of that fund, that's my fund. And I don't feel guilty about spending that because that's what I've earmarked it for. So things like that, and we start to need to rewire, and then when you start to rewire those stories, and you start to tell a different one, others will come up. So there'll be other ones which now we're sort of talking about retirement and all of that, even though I'm still a fair way away from that, but my husband's a bit closer. So like, oh, what do we want to do? Where do we want to be? What sort of house do we want? Like, there's so many different things. So the conversations change. There's still issues to resolve, and there's still stories to overcome, but the stories change. They kind of grow with you. It's a little bit like, whether or not you have the money or not to put your kid into a private school, or you save money for your child. Whether you do or you don't, at the end of it, you're either lamenting the fact that you don't have it, or then when you do have it, the other problem becomes making sure that your child is or children are savvy enough to know what to do with it. So that's my next hurdle, is to make sure that she understands the value of money as well. So that's going to be an interesting educational journey too. But again, different stories, different issues. But it's a nice issue to have. But it's the stories. Like, I look back at my childhood, and especially I grew up in a very patriarchal kind of culture on my dad's side, where the girls were just there to serve. I was even having a conversation about this recently, where there were arranged marriages still. When I was 18, I was at my cousin's engagement party, and a man approached my father to ask whether his son could marry me. And I remember just being horrified, that could still happen in my generation, like this day and age. My father was laughing his head off. He thought it was hilarious, and I didn't think it was funny at all. I was just like, I can't even believe they asked. So, and I know there's still cultures that have that kind of thing going on. So there's so many stories buried amongst the cultures, amongst the genders, amongst the generations too. I grew up, my parents were a bit older when they had me. So they were in their mid-30s. And in those days, that was quite old. So I had older grandparents, older parents. So I was experiencing different money stories. So I was still hearing stories firsthand from World War II, from my grandmother, my grandfather, and they were in Europe, like in Vienna. My grandfather that I grew up with was from Latvia, and my grandmother was Austrian, so they were like in the thick of it. So I'm hearing so many stories about lack, and I'm seeing the effects of those stories on their behavior as well, and how they were frugal and just saved everything, like all of the glass bottles from the cranberry juice that my grandmother used to drink. She stored them all and put water in them in case the water got cut off. And she kept everything, like even the little tags that you got with a pot plant to tell you how to care for it, was still in her basement. So there was so many things there. And then, the little anecdotes that they would tell, and that whole, oh, you need to be sensible, get a good job, make sure you and I used to get grilled by my grandmother on my choices and the things that I did. So of course I followed the path I thought I was meant to, which led to misery and a bout of depression as well. So there's stories to come out of that too. So we learning from them, and rather than just lamenting them, taking a good look at it and going, okay, that's a story I'm telling myself. I want to rewrite that story. If I could rewrite it, not if, because I want to rewrite it, what am I going to write instead? And that part becomes a bit intimidating too, because especially if you have, like, imagine sitting with a blank screen and going, what am I going to write? Start just journaling. You can even start with your existing story and edit it. If you really want to, you can write it down. I do a process with my clients called my money history. where they basically write down, there's a series of questions and you write down some of your history and you can actually then go back and edit it and rewrite those parts of the story. And that's the way I like to do it, because it is very difficult to do it completely from scratch, because we've often never even thought the possibility of, I could write my own story. What would that look like? I have no idea. I don't even know what I love to do anymore. I hear that so often and it crushes me, because I was going, oh my goodness, our souls are, our inner child is crying right now, because we've forgotten what we love to do and what we want to be, who we wanted to be when we were children. Like, even I have to think back and go, I'm almost like tempted to write down every time my daughter says it, what she wants, so that if she gets to that point when she's older, I can show her the list and go, these are the things that you wanted to be when you're a kid. Wasn't that amazing, the imagination that you have or had? And try and reconnect with that. So I know it's a little bit of a ranty episode today, but I hope some of what I've said has resonated, through the imposter syndromes and the conditioning and the fear and the negativity biases and the stereotypes that smother us, and the stories that come with those that prevent us from actually experiencing what we want and heading in the direction of what we want. But if you take anything away from today, is please just start listening to the voices that the words you're saying, the stories in your head, become aware, and then start to figure out how to rewrite those stories and figure out what's holding you back, because life is precious and we want to live as fully and completely and as lovingly as we possibly can. So with that, I will leave you to enjoy the rest of your week.